Thank you for joining us for another edition of Against the Current. Dan Proft coming to you from atop the Old Republic building at the Skyline Club in downtown Chicago. And my guest on this edition is Kerry Lester. She is a columnist and political reporter for the Daily Herald, former Springfield Bureau Chief for the Associated Press, been covering politics and policy for the better part of the last decade in Illinois. Kerry, thanks so much for joining us.
It's really nice to be here.
Appreciate it. So why don't we start with just kind of give your overview as the columnist, not the reporter side, the columnist side where you're allowed to give your opinions. On this election, everybody focuses on the presidential election, but little known fact, we also have state and local elections on November 8th of 2016. And your kind of perspective on the state and local elections in Illinois this cycle.
Right. Well, Dan, the thing I keep hearing over and over again in press scrums is, God, I hate this cycle. I can't wait for it to be November 9th. And I think that there is a universality in that this cycle, both at the top and at the bottom of the ticket, is increasingly nasty. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think once you look past the presidential race and you go further down the ballot, all the money in the race and the ability to purchase ads and mailers that have inundated the airwaves.
The money is different this time than it's been. I mean, I've been in this racket for 20 years. The money is different this time around than certainly since I've been involved, so since you've been involved. And that kind of is impactful, right? I mean, it changes the dynamic of the race. And full disclosure, as people know, I think I run a super PAC, so I'm also manifestly involved in these races, supporting legislative candidates, and with a lot of money too. But the money seems to be a big part of the story, in addition to seemingly the referendum on Ronner if you're a Democrat versus the referendum on House Speaker Madigan if you're a Republican.
Right. The money very well may be the key part of the story. And you know, Madigan certainly always had money, but the way money is coming in, particularly on the Republican side, these $1 million checks from major donors, the governor himself, several of his friends, Ken Griffith, Richard Uihlein, and how it's funneling through. It's going from some candidates.
Yes.
Yeah, of course, I know you do.
Yes.
But it's going from somebody like Comptroller Leslie Munger, then to the Illinois Republican Party, and then out to candidates at a very rapid rate.
And then on the other side, too, you have money funneling to legislative candidates, a lot of legislative candidates that are safe or seemingly safe, and then moving through. So it's kind of happening on both sides.
Right. And I think the ability of Republicans to infuse more races with money is making Democrats strategize more wisely in terms of how to spend theirs. I mean, because it's not an unlimited pot as perhaps they felt they've had in the past.
Do you think that Madigan's profile has been leveled up substantially? I mean, he's the longest serving House Speaker in Illinois history. He's right on the cusp of being the longest serving House Speaker at the state level in United States history. But I don't think in my opinion, I don't think he's had the profile he's had in past cycles like he has this cycle, and that may end up to be kind of one of the contributing factors to how these legislative races turn out, and by extension, what the balance of power in Springfield looks like after November 8th.
I think that's right, and I'll be curious to see how this all ends up. But, you know, I go to the gym in the morning, I'm on the treadmill for 30 minutes, I see 4 or 5 different commercials with Madigan's face plastered all over them. So, you know, Republicans are very clearly tying Democrats seeking re-election to Madigan. That's their strategy. And I think Madigan is unpopular on a statewide level, but just how much so, the proof will be in the pudding. And
it seems like, so I cut my teeth in this business 20 years ago working for Lee Daniels, the House Speaker for that 2-year interregnum in 94 to 96, and then the minority leader after that. And there was always, Mike Madigan was a factor, but it seemed like Republicans were unable to really connect the dots. And speaking of the suburbs, because Daily Herald is the suburban, the suburban cook in the collars, paper of record. The Republicans had a difficult time connecting the dots in voters' minds between Mike Madigan and their local legislator. And it seems like maybe this cycle, those dots are being connected in a way they haven't been previously.
Right, and I think the governor and his staff have run a very top-down organization, and they've been in good communication with members of the House. And so you saw Republicans try to tie Democrats to a lot of roll call votes. That's traditionally a Democratic move, that will be, seen on ads and mailers, that you're backing the Mike Madigan agenda.
And so is there a substantive distinction that you see in terms of policy choices? You have Governor Rauner's turnaround agenda that hasn't gone anywhere his first 2 years because of the super minorities that Democrats enjoy in the House and the Senate. And there's been relative unity among the Republican caucuses. But do you see a substantive kind of policy agenda choice manifesting itself that will also potentially be impactful in the outcomes of these legislative elections between the governor's turnaround agenda and what Mike Madigan wants to do for the state, or, as I would argue, to the state?
Right. I mean, well, there's a classic policy difference, but I do think at this point, neither Governor Rauner or Madigan is denying that a tax increase is likely needed to help shovel out the state when we do eventually pass a full year budget, whenever that is. The turnaround agenda is a key thing. I mean, when the stopgap budget was negotiated over the summer, one of Madigan's repeated statements was that this was able to get done because the governor was able to take his turnaround agenda off the table. So it's a question of if a budget has to have things attached to it or not.
Is your sense, I mean, as somebody who's been in Springfield, so it's Springfield Press Corps, in the suburbs now, Madigan is unpopular, as you said. There's no question about it. The polling data bears it out. But that's not the same thing as saying Governor Rauner is popular. He's just less unpopular, because it seems to me both sides have taken on water as a result of the impasse over the first 2 years of Governor Rauner's administration. And so the question is, and to some extent, I think this is what the governor is suggesting, well, I've been willing to deal, to your point, I'm willing to talk about a tax increase, but I need structural reforms to change the trajectory of Illinois in return. And Madigan is just unwilling to do anything on structural reforms. He just wants the tax increase. And so maybe that turns out to be a kind of marginal benefit to Republicans in close races that they've lost in previous cycles, that perhaps turns out to be, they turn out to be victorious this cycle.
Right, Dan, I think that's right. And I think that Governor Rauner is certainly facing his own pressure, but he's not up for re-election until 2018,
right,
if he should choose to run. The pressure is on Madigan to maintain his majority and to maintain his supermajority. And so nobody has been able to completely figure this guy out in the 3 decades that he's been in power down there. But I think that if you look through the lens of him working to maintain his majority, that helps you get there.
How do you look at the statewide races this cycle? Right, Rauner's not up. And separating the presidential race for a moment, because I think people are separating that race in their minds. That's the polling that I've seen, that I've done, that kind of bears that out. But the comptroller's race, Leslie Munger versus Susana Mendoza, unusual that you have a constitutional office in this off year, or a presidential year, off year for our constitutional officer elections. And then the Mark Kirk, Tammy Duckworth statewide race. Do you see either one of those as proxy statewide races for the Madigan-Rauner battle?
I think the comptroller race is an excellent example of that. I mean, you have Comptroller Munger accusing Mendoza of being a career politician, somebody like Madigan. She was a 6-term state legislator before she was a city clerk. But then you have Mendoza turning the tables on Munger and pointing to all the money she's received from the governor, from his friends, and saying she's not quite as independent as she's claiming to be.
Right, but I mean, so Munger is calling Mendoza a career politician because she's, been a politician for her career. So that seems to make some sense.
Right, but that's a typical Republican
right,
accusation of Democrats who have been there, career politicians.
Right.
This is why we want term limits.
Right.
So it goes with the statewide storyline.
And Munger has received a lot of individual contributions, but she's someone that was tapped from the outside to come in and be the state comptroller. I mean, she ran for legislative office and lost.
Right, to Carol Senti.
Right,
yeah,
in 2014 in Lake County. But then she's tapped by Rauner, which was an unusual, in my opinion, an inspired choice, bringing talent in, from the outside. She spent her career in corporate America, successful executive, very sharp. And it really is a contrast and a choice, seems to me, being presented, not dissimilar from Rauner versus Quinn in 2014, which is, do you want somebody coming from the outside in who's spent their career in business versus someone who's spent their career in the public sector? Or do you want to kind of default back to kind of somebody who's spent most of their working life in the public sector. It seems to me Munger and Mendoza is a bit of an extension of the Rauner versus Quinn choice.
Right. I agree. I do think, though, there is that question looming out there of Munger's ties to the governor, and is she an independent leader, or is she going to be controlled by what he wants because of the dollar signs?
And how does the Senate, I mean, other than thinking about the U.S. Senate race between Kirk and Duckworth in the context of control of the Senate at the national level, to me, that race has been unbelievably quiet for an important U.S. Senate race in the state of Illinois that's, arguably competitive.
Right. I mean, well, yeah. I mean, it'll help decide who has control of the Senate.
Why has it been so quiet?
It's an odd race. You have two disabled veterans who are going after one another on veterans issues. There's heightened political correctness here, but I think that the focus has been on other things. I mean, you have Kirk. He's an unusual Republican. You and I have talked about that. And he's tried to distance himself from Trump. He's really distanced himself from the Republican Party, and so it's almost a race to the center as they're looking to get voters in my neck of the woods in moderate suburban swing territories.
Well, it's going to be really interesting because Duckworth was kind of tapped by Rahm Emanuel, Tiny Dancer, as I've popularized him.
And she's a mentee of Dick Durbin.
In Durbin, right. But in 2006, she runs against Peter Roskam in that West Suburban congressional district, loses a close race to replace Henry Hyde. So, and then she said, okay, well, so this is someone who has some upside. That's what the Democrats are thinking. So they appoint her to be state VA secretary and those sorts of things, keep her around. And then obviously the congressional seat where she defeats Joe Walsh for the congressional seat. So now she's poised for this. And it's very interesting to me because what if Kirk loses, and I think he's going to lose. If Kirk loses and say Leslie Munger wins and say Republicans pick up seats, even against the backdrop of Trump losing Illinois and perhaps badly, if the House and Senate Republicans pick up seats and Munger wins and Kirk loses, does that say something about Mark Kirk?
Of course it says something about Mark Kirk. It says something about the campaign he's run. It says something about the type of Republican that is perhaps electable in Illinois. But it's just, you've seen the polls, I've seen the polls. Duckworth seems to be very clearly ahead at this point, but it's a sensitive race. I mean, I don't know if you read the newspaper endorsements, but I know the Tribune's was controversial because it cited his stroke as one of the reasons that he was perhaps, the lesser of the two candidates.
He can no longer do the job, is essentially what the Tribune argued. Yeah. I mean, I've had some exposure to Mark Kirk, not recently because I've been very critical of him, and not because of his capacity to do the job. I think he has the intellectual capacity to do the job. I think he's just made horrific public policy choices that have been antagonistic to the conservative base of the party, even to the kind of middle-of-the-road component of the party, at everything from school choice to the big government climate change gambit to the range of issues, to wanting to level up Obama's Supreme Court nominee before the November election, right, to being kind of openly declaring war on the nominee of the party. I just think he's done a lot of very curious things, trying to kind of run to the left of Duckworth and shed his label. And my experience is when you say, my name is Mark Kirk, I'm a Republican and I apologize, you usually lose, because apologizing for who you are is not particularly persuasive. But what I would say, and have said, is that when Mark Kirk loses and Leslie Munger wins, which I think is going to happen, and we, because I'm part of the Republican Party by necessity, we pick up seats, we move on Madigan and Cullerton in the General Assembly. I want the message to be clear that Mark Kirk lost because he declared war on the conservative base of the party, and he said basically, get out. I don't need you, I don't want you. That's how I take Mark Kirk's policy choices and his rhetoric in defense of those policy choices. And so when conservatives skip that race, much like you could argue never Trumpers skip the presidential race, the message should be sent and the message should be reported that Mark Kirk lost because he declared war on his base, and that's a difficult way to run for statewide office or any office.
Well, but just to finesse that point a little bit, I watched him for a long time represent the 10th Congressional District. I mean, that is a district now represented by Congressman Bob Dole. It's very moderate. I mean, you have a large Jewish population that Kirk was ultimately able to bring over to support him. And I think he did a very good job. But does that, representing his district and representing the feelings of his constituency, but how does that translate on a statewide level? I think that's another question. But when you say things like declaring war on the conservative wing of the Republican Party, I guess the thing I don't immediately understand is, are you questioning his moderacy, or are you just questioning the way he's gone about that moderacy?
Well, both. Both, because Dold is moderate too, but he enjoys much more unified support than Mark Kirk does. Because he doesn't say, if you disagree with me on traditional marriage, you're a bigot, which Mark Kirk says. He also voted against opportunity scholarships for poor black kids in Washington, D.C., which I find contemptible. So I have some issues with Bob, and I don't think he needed to do that. So I have issues with Bob Dole too. But I think by and large, he's tried to be a party builder, even where there have been some differences. So there's not litmus tests so much, even when there are substantial disagreements. But when another issue of the last year, the Planned Parenthood undercover videos come out, and it's clear that Planned Parenthood is illegally trafficking in baby body parts. And Mark Kirk not only says, I don't see anything wrong here, he says, I'm going to double down and I'm going to lead the fight to continue to send $500 million of your money to Planned Parenthood. Bob Dole wasn't doing that. So to me, the antagonism, the leadership for the left that Mark Kirk has provided on a range of issues, both domestic and international, is substantially different, qualitatively different than what Bob Dole and other moderates in the party have done. It's one thing to be a moderate or a conservative and say, we have some disagreements, but I'm enlisting the support of the entire party. Mark Kirk, it seems to me, says, I'm a moderate. I reject the Republican Party label. I have to run on it because that's how I've spent my career, running as a Republican. That's how I've been in office for the last 15 years with an R next to my name, so I can't switch sides. I'm just switching sides substantively, and anybody who doesn't like it is a bigot, is an anathema, and I don't need them. Okay, you don't need me? Then I won't be there for you.
Well, and there's a noticeable lack, I think, of outside support. I mean, you have the guy that's running his campaign. He's a former worker for Tom Cross, Kevin Arnold, very nice guy. But I've kind of gotten the sense that they feel like an island at times. I mean, there are commercials. I mean, there is monetary help, but in terms of people swooping in from Washington, as you've seen with other big races in years past, we're not really seeing that.
Or money. I mean, compare what Mark Kirk enjoyed in 2010 running against failed mob banker Ali G to what he enjoys today. He's off the grid for the National Republican Senatorial Committee. That says something too, I would just say. I mean, not just in terms of kind of the realpolitik of which are competitive races nationally, we've got to look at a map, but it also says something about kind of the insular, myopic, listless nature of his representation, of his staff, of his campaign. And, those things turn out to matter. Mark Kirk, people forget this, you win and you're a genius, lose and you're an idiot. Okay, well, in 2010, in a wave year in response to Obamacare, where Republicans took back the House, Mark Kirk barely defeated a failed mob banker, a terrible candidate in Alexei Giannoulis, whose bank literally failed in the kind of the weeks running up to the campaign. It had to be bailed out by taxpayers for $400 million, and his family gets golden parachutes out of it too. I mean, could you have a weaker candidate? No, you could not. Now he's running against somebody who is a roll call vote for the left. There's no question about that with Tammy Duckworth. She does not think for herself. She asked permission, but she did serve our country honorably and heroically, and nobody takes that away from her. So that's a very different dynamic than Mark Kirk faced in 2010, and it seems to be it's generating a very different result. He's not going to get away with his antipathy for conservatives that he got away with in 2010.
Yeah. Something I always wanted to ask your opinion on. Kirk's 2010 campaign guys have largely all moved to the governor's staff and his campaign operation.
Right.
What does that say?
I think it says that they were looking to level up. I mean, I know some of the people that left, and not just left to go to Ronner's campaign, because that's the next big campaign. You got to win the governor's race to turn the state around. But also, they have left to go into lobbying or other consultancy work. But I know people, and I'm not going to name names, but I know people who just had their fill of Mark Kirk, even not from an ideological perspective, but from an interpersonal perspective. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was that famous story, or it was almost a story, about how Mark Kirk treated his staffers.
Yes.
And it got aired through a blog, and then I think the publication, it may have been the Tribune, but I may be misspeaking, ultimately pulled the story. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Absolutely. And the other thing I would say, though, too, is, at the end of the day, Mark Kirk is somebody whose entire identity is wrapped up in being an elected official. And I think in this era now where we're seeing a great rejection of the political ruling class, I think he's a bit of a fish out of water. And I think people see that this guy is, if he is not a public official, and not an elected official, not a politician, he could crumble into a pile of dust. And the idea that he will do anything and say anything and ally with anyone and distance himself from anyone, from his erstwhile friends or allies, in order to salvage his political career, I think that is not particularly compelling to a lot of Republican primary voters and voters in general who just see somebody as like cravenly ambitious to stay in power.
So where does somebody like you vote in that race, or do you?
I skip it.
Yeah.
I'm not voting in that race. I've made that public. I mean, I will hold my nose and vote for particular candidates that are on the Republican side. He's not one of them. I mean, I go back to say, if you say, go pound sand to me, okay. I mean, I'll go pound sand. It's fine. Your call. You're the senatorial nominee. I understand it. We won't be here. And I want you to remember this moment when we all said, we're not going to be here because you told us to get out. And when you lose 52-48, 53-47, and then we go back and do the postmortem on the election results, I will present the evidence that will suggest that Mark Kirk is no longer a U.S. Senator, the Senator-de-elect, as I've been calling him for the past 4 months, because of his open warfare with the base of the party. It's just a very curious way to do business. And I know that's been the disposition of many Republican leaders in the state over the last 20 years. It also, by the way, is the reason we're in the super minority in the General Assembly against Democrat leaders who've destroyed this state in terms of having their way with the policy choices and the trajectory of the state. So, I mean, that's kind of my thumbnail on Mark Kirk, and by extension, the kind of the Vichy Republican attitude of we need to make our bed and make our bones with the other side. No, and I think people are really tired of it. Name a popular Democrat office holder in this state. Maybe Dick Durbin, only through lack of competition. But at the city level and the state level, it's difficult to find one. It's difficult to find a popular politician at all, but certainly somebody that's been around and been kind of weighed and measured and, generally speaking, found wanting.
But, you look at the mid-'90s on a national level, and we saw, Democrats get along with Republicans in Congress to some extent. Some, agreements were reached. These days, things seem increasingly polarized. So is there hope of getting anything done, or are we just 11th hour negotiating for the next few decades? Well,
I mean, I understand that this idea of like getting things done and bipartisan compromise, these are the siren songs of the press corps and a lot of politicians on both sides. It's weird to me because Illinois has $230 billion in debt and $30 billion in assets. The largest unfunded pension liability, highest property taxes. So it seems to me a lot of things have gotten done. But they haven't been good. So there's a difference between getting something done and what you're getting done. Bipartisan compromise has not been the problem. That has not been the solution. It's been the problem. That's what we've had. And so sometimes people get together and they agree on a particular policy choice that turns out to be productive, and that's great. Welfare reform in the 90s, to go back to that leveled up from the states, Midwestern states, Republican governors, Engler in Michigan, Thompson in Wisconsin, even Edgar in Illinois to some extent. And then there's people getting together to conspire to rob a bank. They're also working together collaboratively, but the ends are dubious. And I think it's the latter that we've seen in Illinois, people getting together to plot the plunder of Illinois taxpayers, Illinois families, and Illinois businesses. And that's why you have Illinois as the bad example nationally.
Would you lump pension reform and that compromise that later got struck down by the courts in that category?
Yeah.
And that seemed like a situation where Jim Durkin in the House was bringing some Republicans over to agree with a Democratic plan.
Yeah, I mean, that was a baby step. That was a baby step on a journey of 1,000 miles. So I'm willing to take the half a loaf or a quarter of a loaf, depending on the political landscape, where that's all you can get if it moves the flag in the direction of structural reform. But those examples have been few and far between. They've been insufficient to the magnitude of the problem, and they've been late in coming. They've, their hands have been forced. It's they move at a snail's pace in the direction of structural reform only as a last resort when all other options have been exhausted, and the political pressure starts to really ratchet up on them. And I think this is where I would compliment the fourth estate, the Chicago and Springfield press corps in Illinois. They at least have continued to put things like public pension reform and property tax reform on the front burner, so that politicians can't just wiggle off and pretend there's not a problem, as John Cullerton tried to do for a long time. So, there's a little bit of a back and forth there. But let me ask you something about the fourth estate, since we're talking about it. So the community newspapers that I'm a part of that have been, criticized by your brethren, and that's fine. We did a little story about the top 60-odd journalists in the state. And we found that 86% of them are Democrat primary voters. And I guess the question is, and it's very much the same question that we have at the federal level, where we know from Gallup poll surveys that between 84 to 92% of DC press corps journalists, the Gang of 500 as Mark Halperin calls them, have voted for the Democrat nominee for president since 1960, between 84 to 92%. So the question is, do you think that these issues that we're talking about and these races that we're talking about would be covered differently if 86% of the top journalists in Illinois were voting in Republican primaries instead of Democrat primaries?
Generally, no, I don't. But
you don't think that would be different?
Let me qualify that.
Okay.
So this is a conversation that springs up again and again in my newsroom and other newsrooms. Do you vote in primaries? Should you? I generally believe it's your democratic right as an American citizen.
Yeah, of course.
A mentor of mine who got me into political reporting, her tactic is to switch primaries every cycle. And that's what I do. And I think it's interesting. I think I've learned a lot. I think that it helps me to examine issues on both sides of the aisle. So I don't know that has to be the approach for everybody, but it also shields me from criticism. I don't know if I was mentioned in your story or not. I don't know if I'm considered one of the top 60 journalists in the state or not, but it shields me from a criticism that I am blindly partisan. That said, you have a job, I have a job, and I think people know how to do their job, and they're allowed to have opinions. No. So I don't think that necessarily colors their coverage. I think they're able to take off the private citizen hat, put on the reporter hat, and cover the story. And I don't think that makes it a democratic story. I think there are some examples where that doesn't occur. I do think there are people who are partisan and perhaps don't do their job correctly. But, I approach the job in the same way somebody who's a judge approaches a job. You weigh both sides, you try to arrive at a fair decision, and you hope your story's fair. So, of course, there's human error that's inserted in there. And it's not a perfect system, but I don't think reporters' voting records have much to do with the scope of the coverage.
So here's the thing. So it's not about not having opinions. It's about having opinions. My challenge is not, you're this blank slate that comes to the table with no perspective, no life experience, no opinions. Of course you have opinions and life experience. Everybody does. Mm-hmm. Just be transparent about them. Don't pretend. It would be like me saying, yeah, I know I've spent the last 20 years as a conservative politico and an advocate for this policy agenda. But when I'm coming to the table now, I'm shedding all of that. This has no impact on anything I think, any decisions I make in terms of stories I choose to cover for the papers that I'm a part of, or the angle in which they're covered. I would be lying. Of course it does. So my point is to be transparent and to say, yes, I have opinions, but I'm going to do my job. I'm going to here's the angle I'm taking on the story. Here's why I'm taking the angle of the story. Here are the people I'm going to talk to. I'm going to try and provide some texture to the story. But this idea of the objective Scrivener journalist, that's the big lie. That's the big lie. Just concede that you have opinions. I come from, there are Democrats in the story we did, Scott Fornick, the Sun-Times. I'll just make this concrete, give an example. Scott Fornick, Sun-Times. I think he voted in the last 15 Democrat primaries. I'm pretty sure he's a Democrat. That's pretty good evidence. Fine. Scott Fornick, in my experience with him as a conservative, for the last 15 years that I've dealt with Scott, he's always played it straight. He's always gone after the story. I have no problems. I've never had one problem with a Scott Fornick story where we've had interplay.
So he's putting his opinions aside then?
Well, right. I mean, he's not putting his opinions aside, but he's still doing his job. It's just that he comes from this perspective, and and that's fine. But when you pretend that, not you, but kind of generally, the idea that if you had 86% of the journalistic core coming from one perspective, that it would be no different if 86% of the journalistic core came from the opposite perspective, it would be no different? No. No.
But Dan, you have to admit the times have changed. I think that, I don't know that I'm asking for a safe space or a bubble room or something like that, but you had a day and age in the 1960s where Ben Bradlee, the editor of the Washington Post, was openly good friends with John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
And they had dinner together. I think they were neighbors to some degree. And that was open. But Ben Bradlee still did his job, and John F. Kennedy still did his job. Now you have the liberal media being blamed for everything. I mean, you cannot turn on a 24-hour news channel without hearing that phrase dozens of times on a daily basis. And I think it's difficult to be vilified. It's I don't want to sound like I'm whining, but it's a low-paying, tough profession that, yes, it's rewarding at times. It feels like noble work. I love what I do every day, but you also feel like you're getting beat up upon for trying to be objective, and I think there's a hesitancy there to put yourself fully out there because of that.
Well, now the flip side is we both know journalists that are transactional and are in the tank for one side, and it is interesting to note in Chicago, and I can name names and landing spots, when they leave journalism to go into politics. It's funny how many go to work for Democrat politicians in this state. Most of them.
I know a number who've gone to work for Republican politicians too.
Well, I know, just like there's 14% that vote in Republican primaries. But if we wanted to go tit for tat, my list is a lot longer than yours over the last 20 years. And so I go back again. I mean, we've seen this with WikiLeaks at the national level. Glenn Thrush, Politico beat reporter, right? Saying, essentially giving veto power over a story to the Hillary Clinton campaign and saying, I'm a hack now, so you might as well just, tell me what you will and will not allow me to write. That's effective. That's not verbatim. That's effectively what he said. There are a lot of instances of that. There's a lot of instances of these cozy relationships that aren't disclosed. And you know how this is, particularly in these times. If you're not transparent, you create doubt. Mm-hmm. But if you're transparent and say, yeah, I'm friends with Dan Proft, but it doesn't make me a conservative. And it doesn't mean I'm going to give him a free pass on this transgression or that transgression. That's fine. But when you pretend like, no, there's a Chinese wall between us, and yes, I've had interactions with him, and yes, I've had dinner at his house. I mean, like all these journalists that have been disclosed of having dinner at John Podesta's house at the national level. But that does not influence us in any way. I'm not a cheerleader. And then there's emails showing that you're a cheerleader. And there's emails from Mark Leibovich at the New York Times saying, tell me which part of this quote is okay. It feeds the cynicism. And so what happens is those people, like a Scott Fornick or like a Kerry Lester, get lumped in. You're all part of this cabal, and we look at your voting records and we look at your contribution history, again at the federal level. 96% of contributions from journalists in D.C. press corps in this election cycle have gone to Hillary Clinton, 4% for Donald Trump. And we say, well, of course. And so when I see negative coverage of my candidate or my party's nominee for this office or that office, it's easy for people to say, well, of course, because they're in the tank for the other side. And when you pretend I don't have an opinion, but I made a contribution. I don't have an opinion, but there's this email. That just feeds the cynicism.
Well, and that I think to some degree is fair, but I would just ask you don't lump us all in. Look at us at a case-by-case basis. I mean, call us out when need be, but we're not all the same. We don't vote the same. We don't operate the same, and we don't write the same.
No, that's fair. That's fair. But I mean, just understanding the perspective of the layman who reads the papers and tries to be engaged, but does not know kind of off the top of their head the way that we follow this, the body of work of one journalist at one outlet versus another journalist at another outlet. They just kind of see this as an amalgam. Fox News is coming from one perspective generally, and MSNBC another perspective generally. But kind of everything in between is just kind of amorphous, and all of the data that comes out suggests that it is very much one-sided in terms of worldview coming to the journalistic profession. So, you can understand where people don't make those distinctions.
I'm just saying I think that this blanket liberal media statement isn't always fair.
No, that's right. And I mean, and also, I don't spend a lot of time complaining about it. I just want people to acknowledge it because it's kind of baked in. You know what you're getting into when you run for office. You know what the perspective is. You know what the landscape is. So don't cry about it when it turns out to be what you expected it to be.
And that's another point to make. We aren't running for office. We're not elected officials. So do we deserve to be scrutinized at the same level? I don't know.
Well, who watches The Watchmen?
Right.
I mean, if you remember now, you're many moons younger than I, but you remember when the George Ryan favors, the Fawell favors list came out, the first part of this decade, when George Ryan and all his friends went to prison. The Fawell favors list. Scott Fawell, his chief of staff, kept a list of all the politicos and all the reporters and all the influencers that for whom he or the governor's administration had done favors, so that those favors could be called in at some point. And included in those favors was, and I'm not afraid to name names, Rick Pearson. And Rick Pearson, who's been the longtime political reporter for the Chicago Tribune, and no matter how many DUIs he gets, he never loses his job. It's an amazing thing. He was on that list because George Ryan got his wife a job at the Secretary of State's office. Now, is that compromised? Is that present a conflict of interest for Rick Pearson as the political reporter for the Tribune, whose wife got a job at the Secretary of State's office thanks to George Ryan, and he's on the list with all the politicos who got jobs for their friends and idiot cousins? Does that present a conflict when he tries to cover the governor's race or the governor's office? I think it does. And it's the lack of disclosure, the lack of honesty, the lack of accountability within the Fourth Estate, very much like the lack of accountability in government, that feeds the cynicism of the public to say, this is another civic institution that isn't looking out for me. They're looking out for their kind of cozy relationships with power.
To some degree, I think you have a point. I'm reminded of the Dave McKinney example from the 2014 governor's race. And
Dave McKinney, the Sun-Times, formerly of the Sun-Times.
Now I believe he's with Bloomberg, and well-respected reporter in Springfield, and married a political consultant and disclosed that. Even went through a legal agreement with his editors. And yet, campaigns get nasty, they get heated. There was a piece that he was involved in that ultimately he was asked to take his byline off of it. It resulted in him quitting the Sun-Times and writing a very public letter. But that's a situation where, at least from my perspective and what I've followed, and I haven't followed everything, I mean, he did his due diligence in terms of disclosing his relationship and making efforts to separate his personal life from his professional one. And at the end of the day, it was something that blew up regardless. So
yeah, well, you're right. I mean, so that pendulum can swing too far back the other way. Yeah, my point is, to the McKinney example, is you disclose and everybody knows and it's open and notorious, then okay, then write your story. And then people can factor in this information however they see fit. And let trust your readers or your viewers to make up their own minds per disclosure. But we demand so much disclosure from political candidates and from politicians, rightly so, that I think the power that the media has, the idea that some disclosure be demanded of reporters, I don't think is unfair.
yeah, nobody trusts anybody these days.
Well, so. Right. Well, okay, so thinking about reporters and this election cycle and the state of Illinois, where I said I don't even think it's arguable. I think the only person who argues with me about this is Steve Brown, Mike Madigan's spokesman, and he doesn't really argue with me. He just kind of offloads it. No matter what problem you say afflicts Illinois, no matter what the data says, Steve Brown has a three-pronged answer. It's not as bad as you think. We're working on it, and there's a lot of blame to go around. Okay, I got it. There's a lot of blame to go around. Let's start with the people in power in terms of holding them accountable. So with respect to holding people in positions of authority or influence responsible, do you think that the Chicago and Springfield press corps bear any responsibility for what has become of the state of Illinois?
Sure. Indirect responsibility, I think.
How so?
That's right. I think that there can be, and it's not always the case, but there can be a tendency to fall into traps when describing things. You've run the billionaire governor who only wants, these pro-business, anti-union reforms. You have the chess maker, Michael Madigan, who has been in power forever. And so by repeating those descriptions over and over and over again, and not telling the story, and it's more difficult reporting, but by not telling the story of what's going on behind the scenes and what those negotiations are like and where the wall is or when the wall is, I think you are only deepening the divide.
So, I mean, are you suggesting that the issue is like creating these caricatures, like these cartoonish profiles of politicians?
Yes.
It's the billionaire versus the Chicago boss.
Exactly, and I think with the state budget, that same story was told over and over and over again. And you have a couple things coming into play here. You have news holes to fill. You know, you have editors who are saying, we need a story. You need a daily story, whether there's a story or not. So this...
Well, yeah, that's a problem.
It's a problem, but it happens
Create
on a daily
something.
Basis. Well, not
I mean,
create
I'm not
something,
manufacturing
but,
out
you
of
know,
whole cloth, but like
I had an
some-
editor that would say it is the Daily Herald, Lester. I mean, you need to have a daily story. And so sometimes there are no developments with this budget impasse, or those developments aren't immediately transparent. So I think the default can be to retell this story of the divide, and I think it contributes to people digging their lines in the sand.
Right, and then it just kind of feeds this singular narrative when there's a lot more texture to it, because...
And that's the thing. That's the constant challenge to find that texture, but that takes time, you know. And when there are fewer reporters and more demands, sometimes the default is easy. What
about exploring the issues I mean, again, thinking about, we've made these choices repeatedly over a long period of time. They've had these impacts. It seems to me one of the challenges, and I mean this as a challenge, it's a challenge for voters too, and you know, members of the press are just human beings, connecting the dots, connecting inputs to outputs, connecting policy choices to policy outcomes, and then trying to kind of take a step back and say, okay, well, so we've been doing this for the same way for 40 years in the city of Chicago, say K through 12 education. And here are the results. And trying to figure out ways to make it concrete and accessible for people. So they say, you know, even if you're not driving a particular policy choice in terms of a reset or a reform, that we need to think about how to do K through 12 education in Chicago and frankly a lot of the suburban communities differently, because what we're putting in versus what we're getting out, those two things are just not even connected.
Right. A favorite piece I did, and I don't know that anybody liked it or read it, but it was in 2011 when the state passed some reforms to teacher tenure. It was, you remember what I'm talking about. Stand for Children was involved. Mike Madigan was at the table. CPS was at the table. How do those people all get in the same room and agree on something? And so it took me a while to get into that room, not get into the room, but figure out how to observe what was going on and to put those pieces together. But it took a lot of time. And as I said a few minutes ago, I don't know who read that story. You know, to me it was immensely rewarding because I learned how something significant was passed by these players who are normally at odds. But that wasn't a sexy story. Some, you know, campaign race coverage and the money race and ad wars can be sexier.
So, I mean, as part of the problem, going back to your filled news holes, the kind of day-to-day pressure and less resources and patience devoted to investigative stories that really try to explain and add value to readers' understanding of what's happening on issues that are of concern to them, K through 12 education, their property tax bills, et cetera.
I have seen, at least in my time at the Associated Press and the Daily Herald, there has been a real push for investigative journalism, and there's a lot of good examples of people who are doing it very well. Jake Griffin at the Daily Herald is a good example. John O'Connor at the Associated Press is a good example. A lot of their reporting is very Freedom of Information Act driven. I mean, those guys are sending those off on, you know, a daily basis, many of them. But I think it's the variety in news outlets. It's that sometimes the news outlets that have the most money to spend are not focused on the investigative journalism. They're focused on the quick pops, and sometimes that's the message that gets out there. But reporters, at least the ones I know, and I know personally, aren't interested in really digging and getting to the real story. It's just a question of the balancing act and carving out that time as you're tasked with a million other things to get it done.
So continue on this trend, because I think this is an interesting insight that most people don't get in terms of how a reporter's daily job or a columnist's daily job plays itself out. The challenges, the pressures, how you try and identify a population you're going to speak to, how you try and identify an issue that has saliency for a particular population. I mean, how does that collaborative process work with your editors as well as your own opinions about what you think is important from reader feedback or your own perspectives? How does that play itself out? To say, look, I really want to do something on what's happening to the Black community in particular, Latino community as well, on the south and west sides of Chicago, or as they flee Chicago for suburban communities, how that's changing the composition of some suburban communities, as well as the particular issues these suburban communities face. I'm just throwing it as an example, but if you wanted to do something like that, how does that process go?
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I would say that you need to prove that you're doing the daily work, and then you need to be able to chip away at something on your own, as you're turning in that other work. And you also need to have your editors on the same page with you in the fact that you're working on such a project and how it's coming along and what you envision that end goal to be. And I think good communication to some degree really aids that. And I think it's all a question of timing. I mean, there are some stories. I had a fascinating sit-down with Sheriff Tom Dart. I mean, that could be an emerging leader in the Democratic Party. You could see him go on to make bids for other offices. But I had an editor say, okay, you had a really good interview, but let's get past this election cycle before you run that story. I mean, it's just a question of smart timing and workload and collaboration, I think.
Are there big stories you think are undercovered, whether in terms of frequency or depth, that you would really like to kind of sink your teeth into, but the daily grind, the resource constraints prevent that? I mean, even personally, or you see in the profession generally in Illinois?
I came into journalism in 2007 or so. I started, I worked briefly for a biweekly for the Archdiocese of Chicago right out of grad school, but then I moved to the Herald pretty quickly after that. And so the journalism industry was encountering some challenges right away. Pay cuts. I was working in a bureau, and there were times we were working with the lights off to save energy. I mean, and those were really, really tough times, or layoffs at newspapers around Chicago and around the state. And so I don't know that I've ever seen it through a lens other than that. And so I've always taken the approach of you got to do a certain amount of things and you chip away at something in the meantime. The story I'm proudest of, I used to be a schools reporter, and you'd listen to the police scanner in the newsroom, and there was a kid at Elgin High School on the last day of final exams who was troubled at home. He brought a knife into the classroom and he stabbed his favorite teacher after final exams. Completely inexplicable. He liked her, he had good conversations with her, there was no history. She lost her eye, she eventually came back to the classroom to teach. Police later found that he was involved in some crimes outside of school, so he worked his way through the court system and is now in a prison in downstate Illinois. So that was a story that was so puzzling and so disturbing. It took me 4 years to get to the bottom of it. I worked with a teacher first. I tried to build her trust. I got her to talk about the attack, coming back to the classroom, and just all the issues she grapples with on a daily basis. Then I wrote the kid in prison. I wanted to hear why he did this, what was going on at home. It turns out mom was doing drugs, the home was in foreclosure, there were just a lot of issues and no one was listening to him. So he snapped. He brought this knife to class. That was his way of crying out for help. But how police didn't know, or how school officials didn't know that this kid had a lot of trouble outside of his school life, that was this other question I had. So then I looked at school safety laws. And I FOIA'd all the different school districts and all the police departments that worked with school districts around the state about how they communicated. And that finally led to a change in state law about how police and school districts communicate with one another when there is a kid with an issue. And it doesn't go into the kid's permanent record, but it just enables and furthers communication. So that was a 4-year project. That took a lot of time and a lot of diligence, and I'm sure there are things I could have done better, and I'm sure there were oversights, but at the same time it was just something that really struck me and I wanted to stick with. And I'm sure there are reporters all over this town who have a story like that they just really, really were inspired by.
Yeah, no, that's really, see, that's interesting too, because, and the way that you describe it, and I'll presume the way that you reported it, is to kind of underscore these issues, to present questions that then policymakers and constituents have to contemplate, right? What should we take away from this story? What are the lessons for prevention, for contemplating the interaction between law enforcement and school officials, and parents and school officials, and all those different dynamics? And that's kind of a multivariate equation. Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting, but maybe I'm jaded. I don't see as much of that reporting, those stories like that prompt people to think, rather than tell them what to think. It seems to me there's so many journalists, and op-ed is a separate thing, but journalists that are kind of working backwards from a conclusion or working backwards from conventional wisdom, rather than exploring an issue and just kind of opening up all of the questions that are prompted by a particular anecdote like the one that you just shared. Those are the great stories, and that's what a journalist should do, in my estimation, rather than, as you say, just kind of rinse and repeat the same caricatures, telling the same story around the same issues and making this a binary choice. You either choose this or you choose that. Those questions that you're talking about were open-ended. They could have gone a lot of different directions.
Right, and I think those stories are still getting done. I mean, the thing to remember is those stories take time. I mean, that took me 4 years. And I mean, there were a number of stories within those 4-year periods, but you can't write those every day. So I think you have to look at a whole body of work from a journalist and you know, how they fill their time.
What do you think is the most misunderstood matter within the public about political journalists in particular, and particularly those that are both reporters and columnists, because you're not the only one?
Right. I think that something that's not understood outside of journalism circles is the shrinking press corps, particularly in Springfield. I mean, Chicago's got a pretty healthy-sized press corps, but in Springfield, it's becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. And so when you talk about the same narratives being written over and over again, I think some of that is by nature of people not being in the state capitol, and that's really important. The AP made a financial shift during the time that I was there to really place an importance on state government reporting. And so I think they recognize the importance of that, but it's also because so many dailies are pulling out their bureau chiefs. That's an area where they can save some funds. And
so is the result of that you have people that are less knowledgeable about state government and the dynamics and the players going in? Does that create a problem?
I think you learn a lot by just being there. I mean, it's sausage making, sure. I mean, how a bill becomes a law, who's running the committee. I mean, who are the Madigan aides that you really need to watch that, you know, communicate with him? Who's the best on a floor debate? I mean, that's minor stuff, but it all adds together to give you a fuller, better picture of what's going on down there.
How much of a problem is it you see agency capture with corporate interests capturing the agencies that regulate them? How much is that an issue within the press corps of being captured by political leaders that you're supposed to scrutinize because you want continued access to them, and you pull punches or do bidding, not you, but the general you, right, the press corps, because you want to continue to enjoy access, and you have that kind of creeping capture that occurs, politicians capturing the people that are supposed to watch them. Do you think that's real, or is that fictional?
I think it's real to some degree. I think, you know, there are some really unique animals in Illinois. I mean, you have the governor, who is very controlled with his public statements, and I think that is to the credit of his communications staff. I mean, they really discipline him on what he does and does not say. And then you have Madigan, who is controlled by, you know, his own, I mean, he controls himself, but you know, the press, I like to say, chases him around that Capitol building like a hunted animal, and it's a huge deal if you get him for a minute and a half outside in the hallway. So I don't know that there's courting the governor or Madigan going on because they're not doing it, but how we're covering it and what we get excited about, that's another question.
And the last thing, looking prospectively, let's say this election cycle, November 8th, Republicans pick up seats in the House and the Senate. They're still in the minority, but maybe not super minority. Does that materially change the balance of power enough that you're going to see more deals cut in the final 2 years of Governor Rauner's first term than you saw in the first 2 years? Or are we going to be on this track because as long as Madigan and Cullerton are in power with majorities, they're fine to wait Governor Rauner out and take a shot at him in 18?
Right, and I think, unfortunately, it's going to be the latter. This is war. Everybody's looking at 2018, and I think, you have the governor eyeing a re-election bid, and you have Madigan and Cullerton eyeing, a 2018, and if they can beat Rauner. So I think it may only get worse.
All right, on that optimistic note, she's Kerry Lester, columnist and political reporter for the Daily Herald, former bureau chief for the Associated Press in Springfield. Kerry, thanks so much for joining us on this edition of Against the Current. Appreciate it.
Thank you.